We are live.
Good morning and welcome to the Vermont Legislature's House Committee on Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife. It is January the 27th, and this morning we are going to hear first from our Department of Fish and Wildlife about Vermont conservation design and their other land conservation efforts. And we're so glad to have you all here with us. I think Eric Sorensen is going to kick us off, but the commissioner's in the room with us and he may want to do some introductions. Welcome, Commissioner Porter.
Well, good morning, and thank you for having us. I won't take very long because you have two of the great scientists from our department who are doing some of the work that we're most proud of within the department, and I won't take any other time except to say that I think this is really a great topic for the committee to hear from us on. Because it's really the future of the department and where we're moving as a department in our management and in our approach to conservation of species and habitats. So without any more, and I should also point out Mark Scott, our Director of Wildlife, is also on the line listening in. If there are questions for either him or I at the end, we're happy to take them. But in the meantime, I'll move on and ask Eric Sorensen to briefly introduce himself and then introduce the committee to Vermont conservation design. Some of you have seen some elements of this discussed in the committee before, but there are several new members and it never hurts to have a refresher course. And I think it will be helpful in our future discussions on the department and on land use. So thank you so much for having us, and I will turn it over to Eric.
Thanks, Commissioner. And hello, committee. Hello, Chair Sheldon. Nice to see you all. Let me see, I've got to figure out how to share my screen, so bear with me. And please tell me if, Chair, if you can see that.
We can see it. It's not in a slide, it's not in a presentation format yet, but we can see it.
Okay. See if I can get that. Is that better?
That's got it. That looks great.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here. I have to say, it felt funny to wear a tie in my study, but I suppose all of you are used to that, and it's nice to see you all. I have I think about 35 or 40 minutes that I was hoping to present, and then leave time for questions. And as Commissioner Porter said, I think a lot of you have heard some of this before, but I have some new information too that I wanted to present about how the department is using Vermont conservation design. So let me get started. I wanted to just tell you quickly, I've been with the department. I think I've been with the department since 1997, but I actually worked for 10 years in my current position, but working as a Nature Conservancy employee, just because at the time the state couldn't hire an ecologist. So I've been with the department for whatever that is, 23, 24 years. Before that, I worked with the state Wetlands office for 7 or 8 years. And before that, I got a master's degree from University of Maine in ecology and a bachelor's degree from University of Michigan in wildlife biology. I have a great job. I have a really good job. The committee have heard, I think over the last few days about declines in species, especially birds and insects, and with insects, especially groups like bees and butterflies, dung beetles, I think some other groups that are declining. And that's concerning. It's not just Vermont, it's a global issue. And there's continued habitat loss and fragmentation, which leads to a loss of ecological integrity in our landscape. So it's a different scale of loss. And I really think there's a lot at stake. There's a lot at stake in terms of what's happening in the world and what's happening in Vermont. The other side of that is, I think Vermont is and always has been a leader in a lot of these issues. And but we also have an ecological future that's uncertain and I would say not very secure. And I'll just give you some examples why. I'm an optimistic ecologist, I guess I would say. And I think we know a lot now. We keep learning more over time, but we know a lot now, and we have a good sense of what we need to do from an ecological perspective. And I think Vermont conservation design is one of the tools that helps us understand what we need to do. So I just wanted to show, what I wanted to do quickly is go through Vermont conservation design and then go through some examples of how the state, and especially Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, is using Vermont conservation design. Just a couple slides here to illustrate that point about landscape changes. When I talk about a forest block, I'm talking about a block of contiguous forest or other natural habitat that's not fragmented by roads. Here's a view of New England, New York down to Pennsylvania, and here are an image of all those forest blocks that are over 20 acres in size. I'm going to go through just a series of 4 slides and increase the size of the blocks and just look at the pattern across New England. These are blocks over 500 acres in size. You can see, you can see that in places like Eastern Massachusetts, the number of blocks starts to fade. Here are blocks over 2,000 acres. You can see places like the Finger Lakes still show up, but most of Eastern New York or Western New York is devoid of large blocks. And then here are blocks over 5,000 acres. And what's important here, I think, is where large blocks are left. They're left through northern Maine and northern New Hampshire. We are really lucky to have the spine of the Green Mountains and a lot of pieces of state land. And here are the Adirondacks. But my point is that landscape fragmentation is decreasing those large blocks. I show this, I think all of us in the department show our mission statement every time we do a presentation now. And whoops. And it's a pretty all-encompassing mission. Fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the people of Vermont. And I actually joke with a lot of coworkers now about, because of this mission statement and how broad it is, there isn't really anything that doesn't concern us. And in one sense, that's overwhelming. In one sense, it explains why we are doing things like Vermont conservation design, that we need to come up with a way to do this, which is a pretty overwhelming task. But it's nothing really new. We've been doing this for years, and I won't go through the details of here, but you can look back to things like bear range mapping in the 80s, Stratton Bear Study, coming up with a wildlife action plan in 2005, looking at habitat blocks, and more recent stuff like Vermont Conservation Design and the Vermont Forest Fragmentation Report that you're all familiar with. So it's a progression, and I like to put Vermont Conservation Design in this, but it's a stepwise increase in what we know and how we can respond to environmental issues. We're not done. We'll have new iterations. We'll have better ways of understanding it as time goes on. This is the depressing slide. These are the things that we know are causing a loss in biological diversity. And the only one I want to point out is that climate change has both direct and compounding effects. And the direct effects are, how do species move around now in response to climate change, and what other effects are there? But also, and I guess it's not just climate change now, you can relate this to COVID now too, that there are places where people decide they want to move because of the environmental conditions there, or because they're getting away from ocean flooding or droughts in the Southwest. And Vermont continues to look promising in those ways. There was a New York Times article not long ago that featured Vermont and Minnesota as the best places to move. And I think a lot of that has to do with the environment we have, but also the social and economic situations here. So climate change is, it's rapid this time. It's happened before. This slide on the lower part of the image here just shows how over the past 12,000 years since the last glaciation, species like beech and hemlock have moved independently in response to climate change, and the same with pine and oak. And what's different now is that our landscape has been fragmented, and so species have will have a much more difficult time moving in response to climate change than they did 12,000 years ago. And a couple times I'll emphasize how important Vermont is in this region. We seem to be this crux point in landscape connectivity in response to climate change. One other thing about this slide is this concept of conserving nature's stage. If you think of the physical landscape, the bedrock, the soils, the slope, the aspect as a stage, and on that stage stays constant, but over time, the species or the actors on that stage change. And so it's a fairly new concept in conservation biology, but a useful one to think of, that we give more emphasis now to physical landscapes. So here's the problem. We have some number of species in Vermont, and we don't actually know the number of species because a lot of them we don't know what they are or where they are. But as a mission for the department and a goal for most of us, we want to protect them all. We don't want to start losing species. So, and there's small groups of these that we know a lot about. Surprisingly, we know a lot about mosses and liverworts, vascular plants. We know a lot about the vertebrate animals, but the insects, we don't even know how many there are. And the same with fungi, and there are other groups that we don't even have listed here. So how do we protect them all? The approach that's been used for a long time is one called a coarse filter and fine filter approach. And the idea is that if you can identify features that are larger scale features, they may be a habitat, they may be something like a natural community, or they may be a landscape feature. If you can identify what those features are and a usable set of them, then you can conserve those or protect the functions that they provide, then you can protect the species that come along with them. Like here, an alluvial shrub swamp in a brook near me, Pekin Brook. If we protect those, we get wood turtle too, because that's their prime habitat. If we protect black spruce swamps, like up in the Northeast Kingdom, we also get many of the spruce grouse and this rare moss that only occurs on herbivore dung in black spruce swamps. It's called sphagnum. So that's the idea of a coarse filter approach. But what we're finding now is that those coarse filter approaches using things like natural communities aren't anywhere near coarse enough. We need to think bigger in terms of what those features should be. And that's what Vermont landscape, or that's what Vermont conservation design is about. It's a scientific vision of how we can maintain an ecologically functional landscape into the future. And 3 points about it. It uses a set of coarse filter approach. It uses the coarse filter approach. The goal is to make it usable. And so it uses a set of recognizable features, things that we can go out and see in the land and identify and map, like forest blocks and riparian areas. And it's not a tool to conserve in the acquisition sense all over Vermont. It's a tool to think about how we manage and steward the vast majority of our forests and wetlands and cliffs and lakes and ponds. You all have a copy of this, I think, and there's a link to more detail about the Vermont conservation design on our website at the bottom there. So there are a bunch of collaborators that were involved in this. It's been a cool project. It's a highlight of my career to work on this, to put something together of this scale that I think is a helpful solution. This is jumping to the end, but this is what the map of Vermont conservation design looks like, the ecologically functional landscape. A landscape that's intact, that's connected and diverse, that allows species to move over time, that allows ecological processes to continue, and gives us a high confidence that those features will remain into the future. What I want to go through is, I'm going to do this fairly quickly, and I'm happy to take questions at the end about it, but I wanted to go through what those coarse filters are at the landscape and natural community scales. So I'll go through these all fairly quickly. Here are those landscape scale features: interior forest blocks, connectivity blocks, surface waters and riparian areas, and physical landscape diversity. And wildlife road crossings is sort of a landscape scale feature that makes it work. It's a different kind of element though. And the goal for all of these, this is important to remember, is to keep the functions that make each feature work, keep those functions alive, keep them active. For each of these slides, there's a larger map that shows that particular feature. Here it's interior forest blocks in a dark color. Those are the highest priority elements of that feature. And then next to it is a small map that shows the full design. So interior forest blocks are these large for a region. They're not very large in the Champlain Valley. The largest and most important forest blocks we have for interior forest functions, which are important for a bunch of species, ones that are sensitive to human presence. But these forest blocks also do things like provide air and water quality and flood resilience. Again, for each of these features, we have a set of pretty coarse guidelines about what we need to do to maintain them. These aren't meant to be prescriptive, but meant to give a sense of what we do. Like this forest block here, north of Route 4 in Castleton area, the Blueberry Hill block. If we want to maintain the interior forest condition of that, we want to avoid interior fragmentation. We want to limit development to the margins. We want to maintain a range of forest structure and distribution of age classes, and we want to minimize invasive species. We want to avoid, to the extent we can, single developments like this that extend up onto the ridgeline. It won't take many developments like this in order to fragment that block. Connectivity blocks, unlike interior forest blocks, you can see that this set of blocks form a set of stepping stones across the landscape, and you can see pinch points in that too, like here, or across to New Hampshire in a couple places, down here at Mount Ascutney. So it's a set of blocks that form connections that allow a species to move, not just in Vermont, but across the region. This map shows that that same pattern of moving across the region. And this is important for some species that move a lot, but also for exchange of genetic information and for species to migrate in response to climate change. This is a simple one. Surface waters, rivers and streams, lakes and ponds, there aren't any that aren't important. They're all important. And so they are all on the map, along with a valley bottom feature that's similar to the state rivers program, what's it called, river corridor, that protects the ability of the river to move in its natural valleys. I mean, these are important not just for those river functions, but for biological diversity, especially important for animal movement, and especially important for animal movement in places like the Champlain Valley, where we don't have a lot of large forest blocks, like along Dead Creek or Otter Creek here between Snake Mountain and Buck Mountain. Physical landscape diversity is a complicated one. Bob Zano in the Fish and Wildlife Department did a lot of the analysis for this, but it's really important. We want to represent all those physical landscapes, bedrock, slope, aspect, elevation, soils, to the extent we can in the conservation design, because it's on those physical features that are going to endure into the future that new communities will form and new habitats will come into being. This slide is messy, but in this upper left map of Vermont, this shows what we call land type associations or ecological landscape units. There are actually 459 unique colors up there. And the goal of this exercise was to make sure that we represent all of those 459 combinations of elevation, slope, aspect, and soils in the conservation design. And if I go back just one slide, that's what those red additions are. Adding those red additions means that we can fully represent all of those examples. There's some that are hard to represent, like clay plain forests in the Champlain Valley that have mostly been converted to agriculture. And then wildlife road crossings, these are the places where I actually start thinking about roads as places to conserve, which is kind of an odd thing, but here's a section of Route 100 that is of regional importance for animal movements, the Schutzville Hill area. And animals moving across this section of Route 100, I think it's over 8,000 cars a day. That connection provides a linkage between the Adirondacks and the Maritimes. And some of these connections come down to how do we conserve these sections of road? And it's not really conserving the road, it's making sure that we have suitable habitat on both sides of the road. That's all about landscapes. I go through the natural community stuff quickly. Then just a couple other words about species. So natural communities, this is actually my focus of work. So I have to show you a few more pictures of these, but natural communities are assemblage of plants and animals. They recur across the landscape. They are sort of the original habitats that we have in Vermont. They are where all of the species that we have now have developed over the last 10 to 12,000 years. And they're diverse. They range from dry uplands to soggy wetlands, and they are incredibly important coarse filters. Part of the Fish and Wildlife Department's work is to inventory and map these and track them in our natural heritage database. So I wanted to just show you some pictures of them for fun. Montane spruce fir forest on Mount Abraham, alpine settings on White Rocks, an oak, northern hardwood forest on the Merck Forest, pitch pine and red oak, pitch pine and red pine on Pine Park in Rutland, a burning sandplain forest in Colchester. The fire was started because it's a natural process there. That it's hard to get things to burn in Colchester these days. Peacham Bog, a classic bog, one of the finest ones in the region. Black gum swamp from Vernon with trees over 600 years old. That alluvial shrub swamp that's down the road from me here along Pekin Brook. A river cobble shore and river shore grassland along the West River in Townsend. And I could go on, but those are a few of those. Looking at those pictures, I hope you can see how each one of those is a habitat for a set of species. And so if we conserve those examples of all of those, and there are 90 some, and other habitats, we're going to get many species to come along with it. One of the things that was a really interesting part of Vermont conservation design is coming up with targets for young and old forests. Right now, most of the state is, I would call, middle-aged, and I like to think of middle-aged as not being a bad thing. I'm there somewhere, or late middle-aged maybe, but young forests and old forests both have characteristics that middle-aged forests don't. Young forests are really important for a set of birds, and sometimes for butterflies, for grouse, for deer browse, all kinds of things. And we have less young forests now than we did prior to European settlement as a result of natural disturbance. So this gives us a target on how to and where identify places to create young forest. And the same for old forests. Old forests are now thought to be the most resilient to climate change, the places where invasive species are least likely to occur, and that support this rich flora and fauna in the soil, as well as diversity of wildlife and species diversity. And we have way less old forest than we did prior to European settlement. So this sets a target of 3 to 5% young forest statewide and 10% old forest statewide. And the thing that I get excited about this too is this idea of balance, and that it is having set targets for those young and old forests, which are the things that we need to manage for, that leaves that whole middle section of forest as something that we should think, how do we manage this responsibly to get products that we need in Vermont and keep both economies and products as local as possible. Aquatic habitats, this is kind of a subset of that surface waters and riparian areas, but it identifies some features that are especially important, like high elevation cold water streams, the lower sections of a lot of our larger rivers that flow into Lake Champlain that have very cool sets of aquatic species, fish and spiny softshell turtles, things like that. So it's a subset that we can look at to somewhat prioritize aquatics work. Wetlands, this is another one. All wetlands are important. There's nothing that we don't consider important in this. So this is a mapping, the best we have of wetlands in Vermont. And I think we're all familiar with the functions that they provide. Wetlands are one of the things we've talked about functions for the longest, functions and values of wetlands for ecological and social reasons. Grasslands and shrublands, this is a really important habitat. It's one that actually that people have created to a large extent in Vermont, but there are a set of species that come along with them, like bobolink, but also a bunch of insects, pollinators. And so we need to come up with a way to sustain those into the future. And the way to do that is to, well, the goal anyway, is to come up with a set of areas, these darker yellow areas, where we actually dedicate areas to full maintenance for these species. And then another set of areas, these lighter yellow areas, where we work with the agricultural community to manage in a way that's supportive of maintaining those species. Underground habitats, we have maps for these, but we don't share them because underground habitats are so sensitive, and bats are one of those species that have declined dramatically because of white nose syndrome. But how we deal with those underground habitats is really important. So that's all of those two features, those landscape and natural community scale features. I want to say something about species because although the coarse filter, the goal is to conserve as many species as possible, we know that there are some species for one reason or another that aren't going to be captured by that coarse filter and that we need to address independently. It may be something like deer that we address because of the intense social interest we have in the population stability and our ability to hunt them. Or it may be something like this rare painted cup, which is actually one I don't think we need to do anything about. This is a very rare plant. It only occurs on these steep slopes of Smuggler's Notch in a boreal outcrop, boreal calcareous outcrop. And there's not really anything to do. That habitat is protected. This species may not stay here with climate change, but there's nothing really for us to do about it. And then there are others like spiny softshell, put in the same category as deer, really, that we need to address their needs. We need to address their needs, whether it's because of threats to that species. Here's Steve Perrin, I think you talked to recently, out protecting an individual nest on a beach. If we don't, raccoons take over these nests and predate on the eggs, and we could lose the species. So there's some that aren't covered by the coarse filter is the point. There's that conservation design, maintaining an intact and diverse landscape and connected. It's important for species and natural communities and ecological processes. I wanted to jump to something I think you're going to hear from the Nature Conservancy in coming days. We've done a bunch of work with the Nature Conservancy, and I wanted to just put a plug out for their work, but also talk about it in terms of complementarity. The Nature Conservancy has this network that they call the Resilient and Connected Network. And unlike Vermont, unlike being just a Vermont specific product like Vermont Conservation Design, theirs is continental now. They started in the Northeast with Mark Anderson's work, and Mark Anderson has spread that to the continent. It is the best, in my opinion, it's the best available information we have for conservation planning on a continental scale. And what's really cool about it is how complementary it is to Vermont Conservation Design. This is a map of, in green, the priority areas from the Resilient and Connected Landscape Network by the Nature Conservancy, and in dark blue, the areas identified by Vermont Conservation Design. And you can't see the overlap here, but it's in the order of 80%, 80% overlap, which gives us even more confidence in the places that we identify as being important. I would like to put an extra plug in Vermont Conservation Design. We need something like the Nature Conservancy's product to get us beyond our boundaries. This isn't just a Vermont issue, but the Vermont Conservation Design gives us specifics about how to deal with issues in state that are a little bit more refined. Just a couple comments. I learned as an ecologist and a scientist doing this that coming up with a Vermont Conservation Design is about a lot more than biological diversity. It's about how we live here. It's about the features of clean water and clean air. It's about working farms and forests. It's about the benefits we derive from nature. And just a couple thoughts. This Vermont Conservation Design it's a vision. It's not an endpoint. It's something that I think if we can pull this off in one fashion or another, we have a lot of confidence about protecting ecological integrity and species and their abilities to move. Vermont is 80% privately owned land, and this can only work if we make it work for landowners. This isn't a tool to acquire land, it's a tool to make this work. It's got to work for private landowners and their ability to keep their land as forest. I like to think of it as it's not sort of a buffet that we can go and pick one element or another. We need all of these elements, all of these coarse filters kept in a functional state if we want this to work. I do think this kind of an approach has an ability to unify how we approach conservation. And it's a unification of how we approach conservation without telling other organizations what to do. Although everything may be of interest to Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, some organizations may focus on one part of this and some on others. And as long as we keep the whole in mind, I think that's what's important. And again, it provides social and economic values. So I wanted to go through a list just in a couple minutes here now of how Vermont Conservation Design is being used. And this is mostly about Vermont Fish and Wildlife, but not entirely. This is sort of the beginning of it. The Vermont Wildlife Action Plan, first in 2005 and then in 2015. We needed to think about that the action plan is how we receive money to some extent from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for state wildlife grants. But it also is it's a goal of how to keep common species common. And the 2015 action plan was the first time we put in a map of Vermont Conservation Design. And again, it's embedded there because it's how we keep common species common. The draft Big Game Management Plan that's in review right now, I think it's often not thought of as managing big game with something like Vermont Conservation Design in mind. But Vermont Conservation Design is clearly embedded because how we address big game species is no different than how we address rare tiger beetles. We need to think about the context and the landscape in which they occur. And so Vermont Conservation Design is clearly embedded in the management goals of the Big Game Plan. Land acquisition, John is going to talk about this in much more detail in a minute. I just wanted to mention that how we've come up with our focus areas, shown in red here, is closely related to Vermont Conservation Design. And Jane Lazorchik mentioned this project to me the other day that is just a great example of this one little parcel. I forget how big it is, 300 acres, 400 acres. This new, and it's a new wildlife management area, is a parcel that helps connect both bear corridor and ecological connectivity in the northern Green Mountains. And that's, we could get there from many ways, but Vermont Conservation Design is just one part of that. I wanted to mention a bunch of other partners too. Vermont Land Trust has really adopted the Vermont Conservation Design as a primary tool in screening their projects. The Nature Conservancy uses their resilient and connected landscape, but also uses Vermont Conservation Design, and these other organizations do as well. When we come up with a management plan on state lands, every parcel of state land goes through a management planning process. Vermont Conservation Design is an important tool. It may be how we consider that land's important for climate change resilience. It affects how we think about management in different parts. It helps us set old forest and young forest targets. There's a whole list of ideas on how we apply or use Vermont Conservation Design as a tool to think about individual parcels, like here at Camel's Hump. Jens Hilke, many of you probably have met Jens and Andy Wood that works with Jens now. They've now been to I think, all of our towns, which is 250, 254, something like that. And the primary information that they're providing to towns is technical assistance on how to conserve biological diversity, species. And the primary focus of that are the results of Vermont Conservation Design and other habitats. So they've put together this Mapping Vermont's Natural Heritage, and the BioFinder website, there's a link here, is really a public website that displays all the information from Vermont Conservation Design. We do use Vermont Conservation Design as a tool in regulatory review, especially in Section 248, but also in Act 250. And those relating mostly to the ideas of forest fragmentation and landscape connectivity. This was a project in Waterbury, that same North Hill, Shutesville Hill area, when there was a cell tower proposed in the middle of it. But it's a really important tool that helps us evaluate what the situation is on a particular place. Every time we use it, though, we do need to fine tune what it means to have something mapped and what it means on the ground. Just mention a couple others here. We use Vermont Conservation Design as a tool to help prioritize riparian area restoration. The Natural Heritage Inventory, which is the section that I work in Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, we've changed how we evaluate the landscape condition of all the element occurrences that we map. We have 9,000 some mapped examples of rare, threatened, or endangered species in natural communities now. And Vermont Conservation Design is used to inform regional landscape efforts, like the Staying Connected initiative, where you can see again here how Vermont sort of fits into that, that regional connectivity a lot, or a project that John Austin headed up with the New England governors and Eastern Canadian premiers on landscape connectivity across the region. There are two that it was fun to make this list. There are two that I forgot to put on that I thought of after. One, or Mark Scott brought up one the other day. Green Mountain National Forest uses Vermont Conservation Design in how they come up with management plans. And the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board last year or year before redid their natural areas definition and incorporated Vermont Conservation Design into those definitions as part of their funding source. That's all I have.
Madam Chair, I don't know if you'd like us to take questions on Eric's presentation first or shift to Don and do both, or what's your preference?
I'd love to have questions for Eric now. And Eric, if you could stop sharing your screen, I think that would help everyone. We could see everybody. That was really, I've heard it before, but I never tire of hearing it, and I deeply appreciate your work. And as I get connected with what more states are doing, I appreciate it even more. We are setting the bar very high in Vermont with Vermont Conservation Design. So thank you for your your life's work, really,
Thank you. Yeah.
as you mentioned. I guess you touched on it in one slide, but you started out by sharing the sad news with us that our ecological future is uncertain and not secure. And I guess just to put a fine point on it, why does that matter to the human species?
Ooh, boy. Well, I mean, I think there are selfish reasons for that, and there are maybe unselfish reasons for that. I'll start with the selfish ones first. I mean, we derive a lot of what we have from the natural environment, whether it's oil and gas, or whether it's wood products, or gravel, or I mean, there are all kinds of things that we derive from the natural world. And we, as an ecologist, I think of those resources as being in limits. They're not, they can be extinguished. We can use them up. We can use them to the point where they are no longer in good function. So if we want to be able to keep our standard of living, hopefully equalize our standard of living across the state, the country, the world, we have to think very carefully about how we manage those natural resources. From a sort of maybe it's the selfish side of that answer too, is more and more we know that nature is, I think it's referred to as vitamin N, is something that we all value because of the health benefits of spending time in nature. We know that about kids. I can say it's true for me. If I'm had a stressful day and I go outside, I'm much better off. Like, in one sense, that's a selfish aspect. The other side is it's us as part of nature, and it's part of our evolution. The whole other side of this is that nature and the environment, if they persist and function, provide the stability to continue into the future. That without that stability and all the things that come with it, clean air, clean water, I mean, you can think of those as things for us, but they're not just for us. They are things that nature needs in order to continue. So I think hopefully that answered that some. That's a big question, though.
It was a big question. Sorry to throw that one at you first. Maybe I have a simpler one to follow up with, which is, I live in Addison County, and obviously one of the most important and least represented natural communities here is the Clay Plain Forest. And so I understand that the foundation of Vermont conservation design is the more permanent features of our landscape. But it does seem like the forest blocks in particular are drawn on existing land cover, which is just a reflection of our current human activity. I guess I'm wondering how is conservation design used to help us restore areas like the Clay Plain Forest and other underrepresented natural areas?
That's a great question. Along with clay plains, I would add floodplain forests and riparian areas in general as ones that are underrepresented and sort of at risk, partly because of their huge importance to us as agricultural lands. Well, part of the answer, I think, is in using those physical landscape features that we want to represent the clay soils of Addison County and the alluvial soils of floodplains in conserved areas and as targets for restoration. We're working with the Rivers Program, UVM right now on a proposal to identify areas of floodplain forest or of floodplain that are currently not in natural cover as targets for restoration. Another effort like that, and I totally agree, we need to restore more clay-plain forests. It was probably 10 years or so ago, a group of organizations, including Vermont Fish and Wildlife, the Nature Conservancy, I forget who all was involved in that, Vermont Land Trust, came up with some targets on how to restore clay-plain forests and identified several large units as primary targets for doing that. It's difficult. It's difficult, and the problem is once they're converted to agricultural land, especially now that we have so many invasive species, it's hard to get ecologically intact forests back. We're much better off keeping them when we have them than trying to restore them. But it's doable, especially with time.
If I might, Madam Chair, I'd just add to that sort of the more technical or practical answer is it helps us do that. We use VCD as a tool to do that in a whole bunch of different ways. It might come into play when we decide what land to buy or what land we encourage our partners to buy. It might come into play when we decide what regulatory projects to engage in. It might come into play when we decide what towns to work with on their conservation plans or town plans. So there's a whole bunch of different ways that it might influence how we would work to keep the clay-plain forest that exists in existence.
That just reminded me that a lot of our WMAs, especially the ones we're acquiring now with wetlands, clay-plain forests can be a target for restoration on many of those.
Oh, that's great to know. And my last question is about how you use Vermont Conservation. You mentioned it is used in Section 248 and Act 250. I don't want you to weigh in or feel the need to weigh in on the politics of that, but as you know, we're considering the forest fragmentation criteria. And so it would help the committee to know how you're using it now in evaluating projects under both of those areas of statute. More, it's just more specifically, like, so you get an Act 250 application in, it's in a mapped forest block, then what?
Sure. I think we have this guy that works with us, Noel Dodge, who is, he's like a Superman. I don't know how he does this, but every single Act 250 projects that comes through, it's not just Noel, there are a couple other folks in the staff in the department that do this too, but every project that comes through Act 250 and every project through Section 248 is reviewed for multiple features. One of those is where is the location of that project relative to the mapping of Vermont conservation design, all the elements. And I'll start with Section 248. And most of those these days are solar projects and telecommunication towers. The solar projects are generally in fields, although we've become much more involved when a solar project is proposed in a forest, both because those forests are important as habitat and because the idea of cutting forests down to put in solar panels is a little counterintuitive to a clean energy goal. Telecommunication towers have come up a lot lately, especially with the FirstNet projects that are happening now, sort of to fill in those gaps, which is really important. But they tend to be filling in gaps in parts of the state where coverage is poor, but also there are some really important features. So every one of those we look at what type of a block it is in, forest block, connectivity block, and whether the location in that block is one that would cause a significant loss in the function of that block. And there have been some recently, just as example, that are in highest priority blocks, but set off to the side of the block in an area, say on a side where there's already quite a bit of development. And I think those we tend to say it's an adverse effect, but not undue adverse, which is the standard we have to apply. And then there are others like the one I showed for the North Block in Waterbury, where it was right in the middle of this tower, of this block, that is the only forest block remaining as a connection between the Green Mountains and the Worcester Range. And in ones like those, we say, if it's here, it's going to be an undue adverse effect on landscape connectivity and forest fragmentation, and it should be located elsewhere. And in that case, the Public Utilities Commission agreed with us. In Act 250, you know this, you guys all know this better than anyone. We don't have the ability to look at forest fragmentation and landscape connectivity because those aren't specific criteria. In a recent case, we were able to make the argument that a regionally important landscape connection was a rare and irreplaceable natural area, but that's unusual. So unless it's a necessary wildlife habitat for bear movement or that sort of thing, we generally don't address landscape connectivity and forest fragmentation in Act 250.
Thank you. Representative McCullough.
Yep. Thank you very much, Eric. I wish to pile on what the chair said originally with our gratitude for your life's work and this presentation today. I hope you can imagine how useful it will be to us, because I can for sure. I'm thinking connectivity, I'm thinking your highway slides, I'm thinking Department of Public Safety, VTrans, and of course, you and the department. Has there ever been an effort, or would it be a fruitful effort, if there has not been, to identify the crossings statewide of state highways that are critical for habitat, not habitat movement, for animal movement, where reduced speeds would be appropriate in order for motorists to avoid hitting that bobcat we saw crossing the road, hitting the moose, hitting the deer, and so on. If you're going slower, you can stop quicker. Has that been analyzed yet? And if not, would it be a worthwhile project, joint project between the three departments?
That's a great question. And I'm going to pass some of this off to John Austin. There is definitely been an effort. Jens Hilke, John Austin, and others have worked with VTrans on identifying important road crossings and trying to make each of those crossings as passable as possible. Whether it's installing oversized culverts or bottomless culverts or bridges or getting rid of guardrails, there are all those kind of things. I haven't heard anything about speed limits, but maybe John, you could weigh in a little more on that.
Sure, happy to. That's a great question, Representative McCullough. And I think, as you know, we've had a long history of working closely with our colleagues at VTrans to look at opportunities for improving the movement of both fish and wildlife under or over roads. We've dabbled with the speed limit opportunity, and it's to be honest with you, it's had limited success. We've tried it with moose, with deer, even with black bear crossing areas, and more recently where we've got concentrated areas of turtle movement or amphibian movement, notably up in the Lake Champlain Islands region. And it seems to have a temporary benefit to slowing motorists' behavior. And then people get accustomed to the signs and they don't tend to pay attention to them. So another tactic we've tried more recently is to put the signs up at critical times of the year and then take them down, so that because they're not there all the time, they don't just become white noise to regular motorists. That may have a little more promise. Takes a little more time, but I think it could be a little more effective. But to Eric's point, what we're really trying to focus on is finding those important crossing areas and making sure that the land is conserved or protected in one way or another on both sides of the road, and then where it makes sense for a larger investment to improve crossing opportunities, perhaps with either a bridge or a oversized culvert, something of that nature, that also benefits things like stream flow and flood resilience.
Thank you
I'm-
very much.
I'm
Thank you.
going beyond my portfolio here, Representative McCullough, but when VTrans and the highway safety folks look at highway safety and speed as it relates to highway safety, I do think that they look at the history of roadkill and accidents involving wildlife as they consider that. That would be really a question for them, not for us. But I do believe that from a human safety standpoint, they do consider.
Right. It could be a great source of income. Think Wilton, New York, or the Southern State speed traps. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Okay, we have a couple more questions we're going to take, and then we need to take a break. So Representative Dolan is up next.
Thank you and good morning. And next time I see you, I'll bring my book that you wrote and get an autograph. I do appreciate the work that you've done, and it's good to see that we have resources available for us to learn more about your presentation. So thank you for that. My question is regards to that 248 process and to some extent Act 250. I noted other states have siting councils of sorts where they require a certificate of environmental compatibility when they site infrastructure. And we have a different process. We have an older process, the 248, where the language talks about explicitly, it says, with due consideration of having been given to the criteria, the Act 250 criteria. Has that been adequate in terms of the tools you need to be able to help identify and protect some of these to meet our conservation goals?
Could you help me out just a little bit? I don't quite understand the part about due consideration.
That's the language in statute where it says that when we cite infrastructure, we are through the 248 process, which deals with energy and other infrastructure needs like telecommunications. The language in statute talks about with due consideration having been given to the criteria. And you mentioned a couple of examples where you've been successful. You've also mentioned the forest block issue of not having that criterion. But with that language itself, has that been given you enough, I guess, strength to be able to make important case about our conservation objectives?
Yeah, I'll try to answer. I may punt some of that to John and Commissioner Porter too. In all the cases I've worked on in the last, I don't know, 10 years or so, relating to, no, it's not that long. It's only been like 8 years on habitat fragmentation and landscape connectivity. In Section 248, we address those under, is there an undue adverse impact on the natural environment? So it's sort of it's a broad, open category. In any case I've worked on, I don't remember that issue of due consideration to other features or being any obstacle, because usually there's, if it's a project that we're going to get involved in because of concerns, the concerns are pretty readily identified. Like I want to give just a quick example of a project that was a solar project down in Brandon. And that's actually one where the maps, the Vermont Conservation Design maps, don't show the area where the project was as being a high priority for anything, because there's nothing identified at that particular location. But it's an interpretation of those maps and showing that that particular location was a connection between the Taconic Mountains and the Green Mountains. Happened to be in a field, but it's a field with some forests, that those particular places are really high priority. And making the case based on those characteristics seems to be plenty in my experience working with Section 248. Does that answer your question? Or is there something that John or Commissioner Porter could add?
I would just add, Representative Dolan, that's a very interesting read of that part of the statute. And honestly, we've read that as providing us the opportunity to think more broadly than just the criteria established in Act 250. That's to all of Eric's illustrations about how we've participated in the 248 process versus the 250 process, to go beyond the criteria that are established in Act 250 and think about things like landscape scale, connectivity, and natural communities in a way that isn't typically afforded through Act 250. It's been because of how the statute for 248 has, at least how we've read it, as providing that greater degree of flexibility. But I'm intrigued by how you've characterized it, because I suppose it could be turned around 180 degrees to suggest that, were we thinking about something that was more traditional to, say, criterion 8A that we're often accustomed to dealing with, that perhaps somebody could make the argument that Section 248 wouldn't offer as strong a support as we might otherwise like because of how you're reading that provision. But as I said, we've used it to say it affords us a greater measure of flexibility to protect a greater range of resources.
And that's been borne out by what the PUC and the old Public Service Board has done in terms of granting us the ability to weigh in on those broader issues.
Thank you.
All right, Representative Lefebvre.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks, Eric, for the great presentation. I really thought the slides went very far in illustrating some of the concepts you brought out. I have two questions, and the first one is, in terms of climate changes has a direct and compounding effect. You mentioned it had an adverse impact on wildlife mobility. And am I correct in assuming that by mobility you mean adaptation, that climate change is happening at such a rate that wildlife does not have an opportunity to adapt to the changes it's bringing?
Yes, I agree with that in part. To me, there are several factors affecting how climate change affects what we need to do now. And one of them has to do with wildlife, that species need to move. And the problem is that our landscape is so much more fragmented now. So it's difficult for many species to move. Not so much in parts of Vermont, but if you look at eastern Massachusetts or places like that, it sure is. There are many issues. Like there are issues with bird migration and stopover habitats and seasons of how seasons change. There are many factors affecting how wildlife move. But it isn't just about wildlife. Like wildlife are in some ways are ones that are maybe better able to adapt because they're mobile. In some ways, a bigger problem is for plants, where their ability to shift in response to climate change is restricted by their ability to disperse seeds. And for some species, like some of the oaks that travel with blue jays, that might be easier than a species that's dispersed by ants. And that kind of complexity makes this really difficult. Did that answer your question at all, or did I get carried away?
No, it's fine. I understand it's much more complex than adaptability. I'm just kind of wondering in terms of, and taking a page from Darwin and talking about the ability to survive is all about adaptability. And I'm just wondering how that has changed, and you kind of gave me a sense of that. I know the time is short, so I'll ask one other question. It'll probably come up again, but as an ecologist, do you have a working definition of development?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I think of it as I guess I would frame it in terms of how I view it for something like forest blocks, that it's something that removes the natural cover in a permanent sense. So conversion to agriculture is one form of development. Building roads, houses, other infrastructure is another. I would say something like forest management in general is not, although constructing something like a haul road is a form of development. So each thing you can put it in a bit of a framework, I think. But it's conversion of natural habitat to a permanent other habitat.
And there's another element to Representative LaFave, which is the people on the landscape. So it's not just the physical change to the landscape, but the people's engagement on it. If you build something out in the middle of the woods and people are there every day, it's going to have a different effect than if you build it and leave it. And so I just don't want to lose sight of that either. Thank you.
That's sort of the effect of a development, how far it spreads. People make the effect of a development spread much more than just its footprint sometimes.
All right, thank you for the great questions. We are, we have to move on. We have to wrap it up because we have two other presenters today and I want to give them their fair chance. So thanks for your great questions, and Eric for fielding some, your ability to pivot and answer some challenging questions was impressive. And let's take 5 minutes. And so we'll be back at 10:12 to hear from John Austin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Would you mind if, while we're taking a break, I worked on sharing my screen? So I'm not sure I can do that as gracefully as my colleague, Mr. Sorensen, did.
I don't mind that at all. And actually the presenter following you, Mr. John Leibowitz, has the same request. And I think that's a great use of the 5 minutes, although I hope you both can take a break as well. So we'll be back in 5, and good luck with your sharing of screen.
Thank you.
Mr. Austin, you can go ahead and try sharing your screen first if you'd like.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Let's see. If anybody's on and not taking a break away from the computer, like John?
I can see I can see it on my end too. It's just not in presentation mode. So when you go, you would click the presentation button. Yep, but it works fine on my end.
Okay, great. Thank you. Do you see the presentation mode now?
Yes.
Yes.
Super. Thank
Looks
you.
perfect.
All right, great. John, nice to see you. I enjoyed your presentation a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, well, thank you very much. You too. And I'm doing a version of that today, more Vermont specific. So I appreciate the kind comments.
No, that was a really wonderful presentation that you and your colleague did.
Well, thank you.
All right, now, Mr. Austin, if you could click stop share, we can see if John Leibowitz can share his screen as well.
You got it. Hold on just a second.
Sure.
Stop. Let's see here.
See the button at the top of your screen.
Ah, thank you. Great.
Perfect.
All right.
Great.
So I will go ahead and share my screen. And all right. So I'm hoping you don't see my text and only see the picture with the image and all that.
You got it.
That is correct.
Okay, that's the big thing. I don't want you reading my script as I'm reading it. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to test that, and I will I'm looking forward to your presentation, John, and I'll get moving after you.
Great. Oh, right back at you.
All right.
All right, thank you both. We have about 2 minutes left of our break.
All righty, I will
Great.
be right back.
Thank you.
All right, it is time for us to reconvene our House Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife Committee meeting. And from here, we'll take it with John Austin. We do have another presenter following you, Mr. Austin, so just be aware of the time as you make your way through your presentation. That would be great. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you, Madam Chair. And good morning, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. See if I can make this work as well as it did the last time. All right. Okay. Can everyone see my screen all right?
We can.
Wonderful. And you're just seeing the slides and not any notes or anything.
That's right. Yes.
Perfect.
Yeah. Great job.
Well, all right. Well, I learned from the best with Mr. Sorensen. Well, so thanks again for the opportunity to talk with you this morning. It's always a pleasure. I know that you're interested in hearing on our efforts regarding land acquisition or land conservation around Vermont. So that's what I plan to drill into with you this morning. Although before I get to the specifics of our land conservation efforts, I'm just going to reinforce some of the points that my colleague, Mr. Sorensen, made. So with a broad mission and set of responsibilities as our Fish and Wildlife Department has, that is the conservation of all species of plants and animals and their habitats for the people of Vermont. There are some things that are fundamental in being able to successfully achieve that mission. First and foremost is the conservation of habitat. So before getting into our land conservation efforts specifically, I wanted to just give a very brief overview of some of the other ways that the department applies a sort of a broad set of projects and programs to support land conservation throughout the state. Mr. Sorensen has already touched on many of these, and so I'm just going to go through them very quickly. If you have questions later on, I'm happy to dig into more details with them. But the Fish and Wildlife Department participates in a variety of efforts that provide technical and financial support to private landowners throughout the state. As Mr. Sorensen noted, over 80% of the state of Vermont is owned by private landowners. So making sure that private landowners are making good decisions and doing things that are in the best interest of fish, wildlife, and a healthy environment is essential for our conservation interests. So working with our federal colleagues in the Natural Resource Conservation Service to help implement conservation programs through the Federal Farm Bill is something that we spend a great deal of time and effort in. We have staff dedicated specifically to that work. We work with our colleagues in the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation to support technical assistance to private landowners through the Use Value Appraisal Program. In fact, Mr. Sorensen does some of that work with our county foresters. As you know, and we talked about a few moments ago, we've had a long history of participation in Act 250 and the Section 248 process to ensure the protection, conservation, and consideration of important wildlife habitats, fish habitats, natural communities, rare species, those sorts of things. We have staff specifically dedicated to providing technical support and guidance to communities throughout the state, as Mr. Sorensen mentioned, bringing information like Vermont conservation design, as well as other sets of information to guide good decisions at the local level to benefit fish, wildlife, and conservation. We work with a lot of partner organizations on all facets of this technical assistance support, in addition to how we steward and manage public land in the state. So the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department is one of many large public landowners throughout Vermont. Of course, we've got the Green Mountain National Forest, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with 2 refuge systems in Vermont, as well as all of our non-government colleagues and our sister department, the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. We have a whole program within the department that guides the management of our lands, but that is the lands that the Fish and Wildlife Department owns, as well as providing support and collaborating with all of those partners. We can talk more about that as we go along. So again, our mission is broad. Habitat's fundamental to success in achieving that mission. And land conservation is an integral part of how we realize that success. Our land conservation and ownership efforts began just over 100 years ago by coincidence. In 1920, Vermont became the first state in the United States east of the Mississippi River to buy land for the specific purpose of fish and wildlife conservation. Yet another proud moment for the great state of Vermont. We're always ahead of the curve. We now own, 100 years later, 100 wildlife management areas that comprise over 130,000 acres. We were an owner of other properties as well, as you know, fish culture facilities, the Green Mountain conservation camps, fishing access areas, and innumerable properties along rivers and streams, lake shores and wetlands that provide public access to waters of the state, in addition to all of the ecological and societal benefits that they provide, from natural communities and habitats to flood resilience and water quality. And we hold interests in many easements around the state for a variety of purposes. Some of those are a result of our efforts in Act 250 and Section 248, where, as an outcome of our involvement in mitigating the unavoidable effects of projects, say with large ski area development or large wind area development, we end up holding easements for conservation on thousands of acres of natural communities and habitats. We also had years ago the landowner incentive programs, a federal program that has since been discontinued, but Vermont was very successful in taking advantage of those funds and conserved many properties in partnership with the Nature Conservancy in particular to benefit rare natural communities. We use a wide range of funding sources to buy the real estate value of land. First and foremost is our bread and butter, the federal Pittman-Robertson funds. I think you're all familiar with that, but just briefly, those are generated as excise taxes on the sales of firearms, ammunition, and archery equipment. They are distributed on a per capita basis to all of the state fish and wildlife agencies around the nation, and they're administered through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department receives a significant portion of those funds on an annual basis, and each year we dedicate a certain amount of those funds specifically for land conservation. And then we look to other funding sources like the Recovery Land Land Conservation Grant or Land Acquisition Grant, and NAWCA, the North American Wetland Conservation Act, which also provides funding for large-scale wetland conservation. The Recovery Land Acquisition Grant program is an interesting one. We're one of few states, excuse me, in this part of the country that has been successful in taking advantage of those federal funds. They are funds that are specifically dedicated for the conservation of land that supports federally listed threatened or endangered species. We don't have many of those in Vermont. I'll show you some illustrations of where we do have those listed species. We've effectively used these funds to conserve habitat to benefit them. Importantly, I want to focus on the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department specific funds. So we have more recently the Habitat Stamp Program, which is a voluntary program for people interested in land and habitat conservation. You can effectively make a donation to the department, you get the stamp, and those funds are put in a special account, and they are used for the express purpose of conserving and enhancing habitat values around the state. So some of those funds each year are dedicated to land conservation. They're used typically as match to other federal funds to maximize the dollar value for land conservation efforts. And the Vermont Duck Stamp Fund is a long-standing program established in 1986. The stamp or the program requires anyone who wants to hunt ducks or geese to buy a stamp. You have to also have a federal waterfowl stamp. The funds from the proceeds of the sale of those stamps go into the Duck Stamp Fund and may only be used for wetland conservation and restoration. That has been a remarkably successful conservation program in this state that I think we should probably try to do a better job of sharing with the broader public, because while the principal balance is in the millions of dollars, each year we try to spend the interest, which is in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. That fund has been responsible, and I'll speak to this in a little bit more detail shortly. That fund has been responsible for the conservation of some of the largest wetland systems around the state, most notably along the shores of Lake Champlain, along the shoreline of the Connecticut River, and along the shoreline of Lake Memphremagog. A really outstanding conservation success story there. We work with the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. They've been very generous in their funding support for some of our land conservation projects. And more recently, we have gotten involved in using some of the clean water funds through the Federal Environmental Protection Agency for wetland conservation and restoration on Lake Champlain. So inherent in land conservation and acquisition and real estate transactions generally is it happens opportunistically. Somebody has an interest in selling their land, they'd like to see it conserved, they start looking around for a suitable conservation organization, and they approach you. We are approached, believe it or not, almost on a weekly basis with opportunities to buy land for conservation purposes. At times it becomes overwhelming trying to decide where to put our limited resources into a sea of great opportunities. So a few years ago, we decided to take a more strategic approach rather than just jumping at the opportunity of the moment, trying to establish some focus areas to direct those efforts. We went through a long process to come up with this strategic land conservation plan that I won't get into right now, but just to share with you some of the considerations that went into developing it. We looked, of course, at ecological values and needs across the state, where our interests and funds would be best placed, where there's a need and opportunity for improved public access to land, where we have certain management needs on existing ownerships that could be enhanced by adding land to those wildlife management areas, Of course, consideration to unique funding sources that have, say, a certain geographic focus or a certain species or community focus. And then importantly, because we work so closely with all of the conservation organizations in Vermont on land conservation, making sure that we divide and conquer, so to speak, when we're making these decisions to invest in land conservation. We don't want to be redundant or duplicative. If the Trust for Public Land is conserving land in one part of the state, we want to support that and their efforts, and we'll focus our efforts in another part of the state that also needs attention. That's just digging into the details of that a little bit more. So the map on the left shows our current set of 12 focus areas. These are based in part on existing wildlife management area footprints, so where we already own land, and we think that it's important to look for opportunities to build out on those ownerships, in addition to areas where we don't have an existing footprint, but we think that because other partners are not focused there and there's unique ecological features and the public would benefit from more access, we think it's worth our efforts focusing in those areas. So the map on the right shows all the conserved land in the state, the Green Mountain National Forest in the dark green, the Vermont Land Trust and a lot of these smaller properties in yellow, our areas, Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation and Fish and Wildlife in red and light green and so on, just to give you a sense for how it all fits together around the state. So some illustrations of how our strategic plan has worked for us over the past few years. One of the areas that we identified as an opportunity or strategic focus area for land conservation was in northern Vermont. This is in sort of the Danville, Sutton area where we have an ownership. It's referred to as the Steam Mill Brook Wildlife Management Area. This is an area highlighted in this map here in the top right-hand corner. This is an area that was identified through Vermont Conservation Design as being an important connection, ecological connection between the Worcester Range over here and the Northeast Highlands and the northeastern corner of the state up here. There's a critical pinch point, and we have a significant ownership there already, and we wanted to continue to build out on that in order to ensure the long-term integrity of that landscape scale connection. Another example of how we've used the strategic plan in these focus areas is seen down in the southeast portion of Vermont. Here's Route 4 in the map. Rutland is to the east, where I'm pointing on the right, and New York is over here to the left. The green is our existing, that I'm pointing to on the central part of the map, is our existing Bird's Eye Wildlife Management Area. To the north of Route 4 is Blueberry Hill Wildlife Management Area. We worked with the Conservation Fund and some other adjoining landowners in the communities to provide funding to conserve what used to be owned by Yankee Forest and the Yale School of Forestry, this large area that was some 4,000 acres that was a significant expansion to our ownership. It has many, many values and benefits to the people of Vermont, both from public access, outdoor recreation and enjoyment, to water quality benefits. The wildlife habitat and natural community values here are very significant. And in the long term, the connectivity importance across Route 4 going north to south is also a high priority to the department. This is the key connection between the Taconic Mountain Range and the beginning of the Green Mountain Range. So this has been a central focus for ours for some time. Another illustration is down in southeastern Vermont. This was a new wildlife management area created several years ago. It's now known as the Turner Hill Wildlife Management Area. It's some 650 acres. This was the first recovery land acquisition grant project in the state of Vermont. We used that federal funding source because there is a large assemblage of beaver-influenced wetlands on the property, and they support one of the federally listed populations of the northeastern bulrush, a very rare plant that's associated only with beaver-influenced wetlands. So we use that funding source in addition to a variety of other funding sources, including the Vermont Duck Stamp Fund, because of the wetland conditions and waterfowl habitat on the property. to conserve these properties. There are some 5 properties in all that are now consolidated into a wildlife management area. It's a really great place. It also happens to be in a part of the state where there's very little conserved public land and a lot of posted private land. So public access was an additional huge benefit in this instance. So highlights for this past year, we closed on 9 projects. On average, we do about 7 projects each year. We closed on another new wildlife management area, now known as the Town Farm Wildlife Management Area. Eric referenced that in his points earlier. And that was the 100th wildlife management area. Also conserved with an express purpose of habitat connectivity at a landscape scale. In total, we've conserved over 1,600 acres this year. Many of the acquisitions this past year and last year were focused in the Lake Champlain Basin using the federal EPA funds for wetland conservation and restoration. So to touch on that briefly, I'm sorry I'm running through so quickly here, but I do want to be mindful of the time. I could talk to you for 2 hours about this because there's so many exciting projects going on right now. But, and I do wish that Jane Lazorchek was here to present this to you. She's my close colleague and does all of our land acquisition and real estate work. She's unfortunately for us moving on to bigger and better opportunities to serve the state of Vermont. So we'll miss her there. And she's been instrumental in all of this. All the projects I'm sharing with you right now and then some are because of her hard work and dedication, in addition to the larger department team that makes all of this happen. So a couple of years ago, some of us realized the opportunity behind all of this federal funding being dedicated to cleaning up water quality of Lake Champlain. As I said earlier, we're the largest owner of wetlands in the state of Vermont. We own many of the most significant large-scale wetlands on the shorelines of Lake Champlain. So we saw those funds as an opportunity to contribute to the state's interests in water quality improvement in Lake Champlain, as well as an opportunity to build out on wetland conservation from our existing footprint. So over the past couple of years, we've invested several millions of dollars. And quite frankly, I'm astounded at how quickly we've been able to mobilize this funding and put it on the ground. When we first came up with this idea, which Director Scott and Commissioner Porter were strong supporters of and convinced our agency administration that this was a good way to go with these funds. None of us had any idea that it would be as immediately successful as it's turned out to be. We have been overwhelmed with conservation opportunities, with farm buyouts and the restoration of wetlands on marginal farmland. So in addition to the monies, in order to direct them to suitable projects that are appropriate both for fish and wildlife interests and water quality interests, we have an interagency or an internal steering committee with representation from our colleagues in the Department of Environmental Conservation, as well as in our fisheries division. This is a list of all of the projects that we've had ongoing for the past year and a half using these funds, running from the Rock River up in Highgate, if you're familiar with that. That's a pretty neat place, flows into the eastern shores of Missisquoi Bay on Lake Champlain. Opportunities around Dead Creek in Addison County, the Lemon Fair, and even on the lower parts of the Winooski River. And I'll share some of those examples with you in a little more detail in just a moment, but just to point out, in a fairly short period of time, we've put almost $3 million on the ground that's resulting in significant wetland restoration. Here's an example. We've closed on this property. It's retired farmland formerly owned by the Connor family. It's in Addison. It's adjacent to our Dead Creek Wildlife Management Area, which is here that I'm circling. So the property outlined in yellow is what we've acquired, and the vast majority of that is eligible for wetland restoration. It's damp land. It's former wetland that had been drained and used for agriculture for a long time. It's marginal for agricultural interests, and we're putting a plan together now to restore the entire thing. Some of it will go back to clay plain forest, some of it will go back to scrub shrub wetlands, and some of it will become wet meadow and open water wetland conditions.
John, I'm just going to let you know that I can't see when you say you're pointing. I can't see it. Your verbal
Oh.
descriptions have been good, and
Okay.
so I'm not losing you, but just so you know, we can't see your pointer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate you letting me know that. Here's another example. This is on the Rock River in Highgate. The Rock River begins in the town of Highgate, relatively short river system, actually flows north into Canada and then comes back south and enters Lake Champlain on the eastern shores of Missisquoi Bay, flows under Interstate 89, which you can see on the photo on the left. Interstate 89 running north to south, heading up towards Canada. We have an existing wildlife management area along the Rock River, known as the Rock River Wildlife Management Area. The area that is outlined in red, I'm sorry, that's kind of faint, but I'm looking at the map on the left. If you can see the red outline on the southern portion of our wildlife management area, that's what we have purchased with these EPA funds. That also has extensive opportunities for wetland restoration. In that case, much of it will be restored to floodplain forest habitat. We have a goal, by the way, of with these EPA funds and all of this wetland conservation and restoration work in the Champlain Basin of a minimum of 40% of the overall lands conserved being restored to wetlands. Right now, we're at 64% with all of the projects that we have conserved thus far. And we have a team of people in our department and in the Department of Environmental Conservation, in addition to working with colleagues in the Nature Conservancy, who are designing the wetland restoration plans for these projects. Another example of wetland restoration and using these federal funds is seen on the lower Winooski River. The map on the left shows a dotted outline. That's the Fitzgerald Farm, or former Fitzgerald Farm. The Fitzgeralds decided to retire. There was no interest in the family or other neighboring farmers to continue farming that property. It's land that gets flooded by the Winooski River every spring and sometimes in the fall. That large peninsula that you can see, that's oxbow, that's created by the wetland or the river there. That's the farmland that floods every year. It fills up, that's a really interesting spot. It fills up with migratory birds, especially in the spring when we have high waters, a lot like the Lemon Fair River, if you're familiar with that. I'm sure you are, Madam Chair, down in your neck of the woods in Addison County. Those areas are magnets for migratory birds. And when they're flooded, often in the spring, sometimes in the fall, they're filled with wading birds, shorebirds, migratory waterfowl, you name it. There's really rich places. We now own that. So that's become an addition to what we call the Intervale Wildlife Management Area, because we've owned land in this part of the state for some time now. And that will also be restored and managed as a wildlife management area. And of particular note here, this is going to afford some really wonderful opportunities for people in the greater Burlington area to have access for places to go fishing, to go wildlife watching. It's a handy place for those folks. These photos illustrate how the area floods every year, every spring, and starting in late March and going into May. This is what it looks like. Another one that's just came up is the Senesac Farm, and that is adjacent to the Fitzgerald Farm. So on the map that you're looking at, the two areas that are outlined in red, the one we just looked at, the Fitzgerald Farm, is on the left. On the right is the Senesac Farm. They have just expressed an interest in retiring their farm and selling it to the Fish and Wildlife Department. So that will be consolidated into a larger Intervale Wildlife Management Area ownership, and the vast majority of it restored into various wetland conditions. Forgive me. So to wrap it up, we've had a lot of success. We focus a great deal of time, attention, and resources on land conservation on an annual basis. We have a plan that guides those efforts. We take advantage of unique funding sources as often as we can. And I would point out that thanks to the creative thinking of Jane Wazorchek, our land acquisition coordinator, as a result of getting land donations, which we do receive from time to time, we're able to use the real estate value of those donations as in-kind match to federal grants. And that helps offset the costs to the department, not just for the acquisition of other real estate, but also to pay for staff time to do all of this great work. So a huge benefit to the department's budget and to enabling this kind of conservation work to continue to move forward. I'm going to end it there. I could talk with you much more about all of this, but I'm mindful of time.
Thank you. That was a great overview and tour of what you all are up to. It seems quite heartening and hopeful to hear about the ability to use especially those EPA funds for acquisition. What's the time frame for the land acquisition planning effort that was the last bullet there on the slide?
Oh yeah, in 1999, the agency developed a land conservation plan to basically set out some guiding principles for how to direct and guide decisions for all three departments in the agency when we're making investments in land conservation. So here we are, a couple of decades down the road, and we're embarking on an effort to update that plan. So we were hoping it would have been done by now, but as you know, there's a lot of things that kind of get in the way of some of this work, so including the work itself. I'm hopeful that maybe over the course of this next year, we'll be able to have that planning update complete.
Great, thank you. I just want to remind members, we probably have about 10 minutes for questions to John Austin. And John, that was a great presentation. Thank you. I didn't mean to overlook that. It was really helpful. And Representative Dolan, do you have a question? We have time, so.
I can hold if we are short of time, but I really enjoyed the presentations. Really terrific to see the level of effort and work that to achieve all the benefits we've been talking about, the public benefits, the flood resiliency benefits, as well as the ecological benefits. So thank you for that hard work you're doing.
Thank you, Representative Dolan. I will say we're really excited and grateful for the opportunity to use these EPA funds. It's greatly expanded and accelerated our ability to do what we've seen as fundamental to the interests of this department for years, which is conserve and restore wetlands. It's one of the most important things we can do, and it has so many benefits for all of our interests beyond fish and wildlife conservation. So it's a really exciting time. I will say I'm grieving having Jane Lazorchek move on from her role as land acquisition coordinator, because for those of you who are familiar with her, she is a force to be reckoned with when it comes to land conservation, and she has done some amazing work for this department. So,
and I presume you'll be replacing her position?
Yes, my conversations with the commissioner and Mark Scott have indicated that that's a high priority for us.
We're still under a COVID hiring freeze, so we need to get approvals from the administration for any rehires. But it would be our plan to replace that position. Yes,
it would be helpful if you could report back on that progress. This is such important work that we want to support you there.
Sure. And as a side note, I'm not sure where Jim Andrews got his information that we were not planning on replacing Steve Parent's position when he retires, because all we've talked about is how to do that budgetarily and functionally. So I'm not sure where Jim got that, but it's not accurate. Thank you.
Thanks for that update. Representative McCullough.
Yes. I just want to comment for the committee, and it's best visualized with the Senesac Fitzgerald slide right near the end, that when we conserve abutting properties, let's say of equal size, we're not just doubling the value, we're like increasing the conservation value for habitat for everybody that lives on it and visits it by factors. And I certainly know that the department knows this, and I expect probably everybody in the room does as well, but just want to give a shout out for that that possibility that's going on with Fitzgerald and Senesac and throughout the state.
All right, thank you. Representative Lefebvre.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Hi, John. Good to see you again.
Likewise, Representative.
My question is, in terms of acquisition of lands, if you take it on a step further and talk about land that has conservation easements placed on it, I'm wondering what the department, how that department interacts with land under those kind of conservation easements. A lot of it's held by nonprofits such as Nature Conservancy or Vermont Land Trust. And I'm just wondering how the department interacts with those nonprofits as far as its scheme goes in terms of either managing wildlife or managing any kind of natural groupings of species.
That's a great question, Representative Lefebvre. So our coordination with other conservation organizations takes a number of forms, but I'm going to use that as an opportunity to bring it back to the EPA funds and wetland conservation, because many of these opportunities with farm retirements and restoring wetlands on marginal farmland, many of these properties have already been affected by Vermont Land Trust easements. And so where we see the opportunity to turn farmland back into wetlands or clay plain forest, for instance, we're spending a lot of time meeting with the Vermont Land Trust, trying to sort out how we can still reflect the interests that they've realized in their farm conservation easements with our interests in water quality improvements through wetland restoration and habitat restoration. So that's one example. And those are conversations that are in progress, but we've already made great progress with them because some of the projects that we have closed on, like the Connor Farm at the Dead Creek Wildlife Management Area, there was a Vermont Land Trust easement on the property, and we had to sort through with them how to balance their needs and interests with ours. We were successful there, but each one is unique. So the conversations are going to take a little bit of time with the Vermont Land Trust, but we're making good progress. In terms of other easements where we might be able to either have an interest or at least provide technical guidance, we have a very strong relationship with the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, the Vermont chapter of the Nature Conservancy, the Trust for Public Land, and the Conservation Fund. We're in communication with those organizations on a weekly basis, and where there's a mutual interest in land conservation, but they're going to hold the interest in the easement, we sit down and we talk about what we know about the property and how we think it can best be managed to ensure maintaining the integrity of the communities and the resources that are on it. So it's really through the long-term relationships that we have created with those organizations that we're able to have those conversations.
I should add briefly that we hold easements on other people's property on occasion. Sometimes they hold easements on property we have, and those include nonprofit partners.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Representative Terenzini, I'm seeing a hand on one of my screens up for you. Do you have your hand up?
I do not, Amy. Okay. I do not have my hand up.
All right, thanks. Representative Bongartz.
Hi, I'm not sure if this is really a question for John or for Eric, but you've both mentioned forest management a little bit. Eric kind of in passing, and John, you mentioned it in connection with the use value program. And I'm wondering about, you've both talked about ecology, and you've touched on invasives. You didn't spend a ton of time on invasives. Down here, it's a huge issue when, in Bennington County, incidentally, when forests are managed, the only way to keep out invasives is to lace it with herbicides in many instances. And I'm wondering how, as you work with foresters, in particular as it relates to the current use program, how you try to work in the fact, if I'll use the term fact, and maybe I'm not right about that, but that in many instances, and I think Eric, you said this, that the better thing to do is nothing, to let forests be on their own without opening them up, because at least here, all that is an invitation for invasives. And I'm just wondering how you, as you work with foresters and as the current use program is being implemented, how you help shape it or move it in a direction that recognizes what I'll say is that fact. I don't know who wants to answer that one, but.
Well, Eric, maybe I'll go first and you could jump in, but Representative Bongartz, that's a really complicated question. Believe it or not, we spend a lot of time working on this one. So that program I mentioned, or the cooperative agreement I mentioned to you at the beginning of my talk, where we have an agreement with the Natural Resource Conservation Service to help implement farm bill conservation programs. There's the Environmental Quality Incentive Program that provides both technical support and financial support to private landowners to manage forest land to benefit wildlife and for healthy forests. A vast majority, I would dare say 50%, some years more, that support, the financial support, goes to dealing with the effective invasive plants on the landowner's ability to cut a tree. Because you're right, especially in your neck of the woods, but also in other parts of the state, the moment you put sunlight on the forest floor, those invasives just take off. And so on the one hand, you could say, well, let's not do anything. Let's just, wait and hope for the best. And on the other hand, there's the interest. Sorry about that. Oh, darn it. There's oh, for heaven's sake. There's the interest of the private landowners who, if they're enrolled in the use value program, for instance, have an obligation to manage their forests in some way, shape, or form. So we're working constantly with private landowners to help them understand and implement herbicide treatments, manual manipulation of invasive plants, and also looking at new forestry practices, time of year, material left on the ground, that sort of thing that can help at least reduce the growth and spread of invasive plants. But for sure, it's going to be a learning curve going forward. There's no silver bullet on that one. And the last thing I'll say is I have to admit, I do wonder if at some point we realize that we're just fighting a battle we cannot win with these invasive plants. And there may be parts of the state, like the Northeast corner, where their prevalence is so limited that we're better served putting all of our resources there where we know we can stem the tide, and then just, I probably shouldn't even say this, but in some areas just accept the fact that they're going to be part of that landscape, at least for a while. Eric, what are your thoughts on that?
I'll just add a couple things to that. First, I didn't mean to imply that the best thing to do is leave forests alone. I think that there are definitely
about that. I'm sorry.
There are definitely places we should do that. And I think John Leibowitz is probably going to give you more ideas on that too. I think the forests that we do leave alone are the ones that are going to be most resilient and more resistant to invasive species colonization. The other side of the other thing I wanted to say is there are places like highly significant natural communities, rare to uncommon natural communities that we work with in the use value appraisal program, and landowners interested to enroll those areas as ecologically significant treatment areas. And in those, the primary purpose is to leave the thing alone and let it mature, but always another condition is to control invasive. This is more of a personal point, but I just want to say how important the balance is between managing our forests and getting products locally and getting them far away. And we have a lot of really good foresters in the state who can get in there and do the least damaging job possible and try to keep invasives out.
That was a perfect segue to our next presenter, I think. And we're going to take 5 minutes and come back right at the top of the hour at 11. How about maybe it'll be 5.5 minutes. So we'll see you all back here at 11 to hear from John Leibowitz. Thanks. All right, it is 11 o'clock and we have John Leibowitz here with us from the Northeast Wilderness Trust to talk about his organization's work. Good morning, John. Thanks for coming.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. I am going to attempt to share my screen and hopefully do it as flawlessly as the two folks that went before me. So give me 1 second. Okay. Can you only see the image and not my notes?
We can only see the image and not your notes. Okay. It looks great.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again for having me. It's an honor to be speaking before this committee. I serve as the executive director of the Northeast Wilderness Trust, which is based right here in Montpelier on State Street. And our organization works across New England and the Adirondacks. And we are the only regional land trust in New England that's focused exclusively on wilderness conservation. I recently gave a version of this presentation with my friend and colleague, Bob Purcell, who's the executive director of the New England Forestry Foundation. And as I hope you'll see throughout my discussion, what I'm here to talk to you about is the beauty and wonder of wilderness conservation and why it's critical to urgently increase how much wildland is on our landscape. And what I'm not here to talk about or argue against is forestry. Wilderness conservation is a complementary strategy, not an opposing one, to continued conservation of well-managed woodlands. And that's an important point. So with that said, I imagine you all know the history well, but it's a critical baseline. So I want to start my discussion on wilderness with a brief history of New England and Vermont, a region that until very recently and for thousands of years prior was home to diverse cultures of indigenous people and the full suite of biodiversity, from apex predators like catamounts and wolves all the way down to the tiniest creatures, all living amongst old and complex forests, beauty dominated by natural processes. And in what is essentially an ecological split second of time, all across the Northeast, European settlers cleared upwards of 3/4 of the forested landscape by the late 1800s in a race to domesticate the land for agriculture, produce charcoal, and cut timber. Here in Vermont, few forests at all existed below 2,000 feet by the late 1800s. And this is an incredible photo of the White River from a century ago during one of the log drives. And it's actually taken right around where my family now spends many of our weekends swimming during the summer. And this photograph is important as it's a reminder that wilderness conservation in New England and in Vermont is not about conserving pristine landscapes, nor is it anywhere, and nor has it ever been. Here is a picture of the White River today, the longest free-flowing tributary to the Connecticut in its full reforested glory. The recovery of northeastern forests, like the previous image of the White River, is a story of hope, healing, and what is often called rewilding. Bill McKibben, he says, and I'll quote, "The Adirondacks are perhaps the world's greatest experiment in ecological recovery, a place hard used a century ago and now slowly recovering, slowly proving that where humanity backs off, nature rebounds." And the same, of course, could be said of here in Vermont. And it's true, thankfully, that forests have regrown, but they have not fully recovered. Even with the amazing reforestation that has occurred across New England, the reality is that most of our forests are just teenagers between the ages of 50 and 100. And also fascinating to consider is that though forested again, most of these forests will remain teenagers indefinitely through active management. Less than 1% of all of New England growth, but we can do that. In Vermont, like all of New England, there is room for more wild forests, more old forests, and missing predators to bring ecological balance back to the Green Mountains. ANR recognizes this reality, of course, without using the word wilderness or rewilding, with the release of the brilliant Vermont conservation design, as Eric talked about, which calls for about 10% of the state to be old forests. And with approximately 84% of Vermont being privately owned, one viable path to reaching that goal is through forever wild conservation of private land. But there are barriers to realizing that, which I'll get to later. Such an effort to protect at least 10% of Vermont as wild or old need not come at the expense of Vermont's rich agricultural history and our rich culture of forestry and farming. Rewilding will happen by continuing to be intentional about the kind of conservation that we pursue. And it's a process that began when farmers began abandoning their fields for greener pastures out west, and was accelerated by the active work of conservationists with the creation of examples like the Adirondack Park, Baxter State Park, federally protected wilderness areas within the Green Mountain National Forest, and more recently, forever wild protection of private lands by land trusts. Simply put, rewilding means allowing nature the necessary space to heal and restore the life-supporting functions it provides. And rewilding also means, very importantly, redefining humanity's relationship with nature and recognizing that we are one among many species. Northeast Wilderness Trust is proud to be an initial endorser of the Global Charter for Rewilding the Earth. And I want to take a moment to read the vision statement because it's a beautiful description of what rewilding and what wilderness conservation is all about. And it reads, "We believe that the world can be more beautiful, more diverse, more equitable, more wild. And we believe that nature's innate resilience, bolstered by human care, can initiate an era of planetary healing. In the future time when the world is whole and healthy, undammed rivers will run to the sea, their estuaries teeming with life. Following ancient patterns, whales and warblers will migrate unmolested through sea and sky. From tiny phytoplankton to the tallest redwoods, all Earth's creatures will be free to pursue lives of quality, and humanity will thrive amidst nature's abundance." That is what wilderness conservation is all about, and what I'm going to talk about over the next 15 or 20 minutes. So I want to put this idea of wilderness conservation in context. How much conserved wild forest is there in the Northeast? Here's a map showing all of the conserved land in our region, both public and private, and it's very impressive. Roughly a quarter of New England is conserved in some way, but the vast majority of conserved forests are managed. And that's, again, not a criticism, but just a statement of fact. Remember what I said earlier, most of these forests are in teenage limbo and will remain so through active management, and only a small fraction are preserved as forever wild. As you see, as you'll soon see, there are incredible benefits to allowing forests to grow old and unmanaged. Looking at that same map, pulling back a layer, here's the map showing the exact same data, but only showing forever wild or wildlands around the region. Roughly 3% of our region is protected as wilderness or equivalent. So of all the conserved land, 97% is agricultural or open to management, and 3% is wild. And again, I present this map to illustrate the incredible lack of wildlands, not to attack the importance of woodlands. It's not an either or. Both strategies are needed to fulfill a hopeful vision and a resilient future for Vermont, New England, and the planet. Yet I say that with a huge asterisk, which is simply look at the map. The amount of permanently protected wild forests across the Northeast is woefully inadequate, and we need to start conserving more urgently. So now I'm going to zoom in and focus on our state. Here's a map showing all the conserved land. And like the rest of New England, and even more so to a certain degree, Vermont has done a superb job of protecting open space. With leading conservation organizations like our friends and colleagues at Vermont Land Trust and the Nature Conservancy and Trust for Public Land. But much like the rest of the region, when you peel back this initial layer and look at Gap 1 lands or wildlands, it's quite a different story. So here's the same data showing only Gap 1 lands. And if we go a layer deeper and see how much land below 2,000 feet is protected as wilderness, and here's that layer, You can see that there's not much green on that map. In Vermont, as in rest of the country, most wilderness lands are limited to high elevation areas that are poor sites for resource extraction and development. Unfortunately, most biodiversity, or at least a lot of biodiversity, occurs at low elevations. And even when you consider just that 3% of Vermont is conserved as wild, of that 3%, low elevation land is grossly underrepresented. So that's what this map is illustrating. So what exactly is wilderness when I'm using this word? In its most brief, it is land that is left to its own will. The root of the word wilderness means will of the land, or in other words, self-willed forests. In a wild landscape, trees grow old and die on their own timeframes. Species form multiple generations, forest complexity increases, niche habitats are naturally created. Coarse woody debris dominates the landscape. Natural disturbances create dynamic multi-age forests. And all of this biomass, complexity, it increases year after year. Wilderness is where nature and not humans direct the ebb and flow of life. There is no forestry, no extraction in wild places. So in speaking of Vermont, we know that practically all of it has been cut over and most of it continues to be managed. And that begs the question, can wilderness even exist in Vermont or New England at large, a region of millions of people, millions of acres of relatively young forest, roads everywhere? And the simple answer is, of course. Wilderness conservation does not rest on finding places that were left untouched over the last 400 years or so, or off in a remote corner of New England, or even places that were absent human settlement before Europeans arrived. That is not true out west, and it is not true in Vermont. Howard Zonheiser, who is one of the principal authors of the Wilderness Act of 1964, pictured here, this is a great photo of him and his family cabin in the Adirondacks, consciously used the obscure word untrammeled in the law's definition of wilderness. Nowhere in the law will you see the words pristine or ancient or untouched. He used the word untrammeled. Untrammeled lands provide plants and animals with places where they will not be deprived of freedom of expression or action. And thus, the primary characteristic of wilderness, as I speak about it and Northeast Wilderness speaks about it, is freedom. Freedom for the land to follow its own evolutionary path. And at Northeast Wilderness Trust, we like to say that wilderness is not simply a special kind of place, but rather a special commitment we make to a place. And again, that commitment is freedom to the animals and to the natural processes that produce integrity, beauty, and diversity of the land community. So again, wilderness is in many ways a choice that we make. And if wilderness is a choice, then wilderness by definition can be found anywhere where humans decide to make this choice. It is a place where we decide to practice humility and to observe self-control, to recognize the hubris of believing not only that we know how to best manage every square inch of our planet or the state of Vermont, but that we should manage every square inch of the planet or the state of Vermont. And it's also a place where humans can redefine our relationship with nature based on reciprocity and not domination. The moment that Northeast Wilderness Trust protects a place, we are taking an intentional step, a radical one, I would argue, to step aside and let nature control its destiny permanently. And that's an important word, permanence. And that's the essence of our work. And here's an example, this stunning property in northern Vermont called Babysitter Swamp. It's less than 20 years, and some may question its value as wilderness, but it's one of the few tracks along a large wetland complex with mature trees. And year after year during spring, the renowned wildlife expert Sue Morse, who owns this property and donated a Forever Wild to the Northeast Wilderness Trust, has documented mama bears using the large old trees to babysit her cubs while she feeds in the wetlands below as they emerge and fall during the spring. Even at this small scale, wildlife flourishes, and wildlife relies on the untrammeled nature property, and Babysitter Swamp is indeed wilderness. So why should this committee be thinking about wilderness? What does it have to do with climate change and biodiversity? should you participate in its conservation? There are sweet values that wild forests offer. Intrinsic value is wild forests have a right to exist. And while Northeast Wilderness proudly protects nature for nature's sake, we also see many reasons that protected places are beneficial to people. And at Northeast Wilderness Trust, we look at these through 4 lenses of biodiversity, resilience, carbon storage, and reciprocity. So let's start with wild carbon, and I'm going to go through this in the interest of time somewhat quickly, but it's important. So over the past 5 years or so, there have been numerous studies published that speak to the unparalleled value that old, wild, and unmanaged forests hold for carbon storage and sequestration. These studies were synthesized in a publication titled Wild Carbon by Northeast Wilderness Trust last year and authored by our board chair, Mark Anderson, who Eric mentioned, and I believe has presented in front of this committee before. In addition to being our board chair, his day job is the director of science at the Nature Conservancy's Eastern US arm. And the document's available on our website. And I encourage you to take a deep dive on it. Today, I'm going to review the 5 broad conclusions that Mark made from this document. The first conclusion is that trees accumulate carbon over their entire lifespan. This throws upside down the long-held belief that as trees aged, they no longer accumulated carbon, or that they became carbon sources. The second conclusion that Mark made is that old forests indeed continue accumulating carbon and that they contain quantities of it. They are banks full of carbon. The third conclusion that he made is that old forests accumulate carbon in their soils. And the fourth conclusion is that forests share carbon among and between tree species, which I'll get to in a second. And the fifth conclusion that he makes is that forest carbon can help slow climate change, as I think many of us are now understanding. So what it all means is that conserving unmanaged wild forests is a useful, scalable, and cost-effective complementary strategy to the continued conservation of well-managed forests. The simple action of doing nothing holds a lot of promise, and it's kind of hard to think about that, but simply letting forests that already exist grow old, wild, and complex, and letting them reach their full ecological potential in an as great scientifically backed potential as a natural climate solution. And it's comparatively inexpensive because there's no management requirements. So the next lens is biodiversity and resilience. So I want you to take a look at this beautiful old, messy, mossy forest. This is what a wild, resilient forest brimming with life looks like. At least this one forest, which is taken from Howland Research Forest in Maine. And it really captures a lot of why wild forests are so important for biodiversity. Howland was purchased by Northeast Wilderness Trust in 2007 to save it from being logged. And it is home to trees that were just approaching middle age when Henry David Thoreau wrote those words describing the Maine woods, that it is all mossy and moosey. So what is so unique about this scene? Well, you can look at the tip-ups and the moss-covered forest floor and the lichen and the fallen tree and the cavities that they create and the coarse woody debris that's everywhere. A mosaic of old trees and young trees. This complexity is not only beautiful in my mind, it also creates resilience and harbors incredible biodiversity. This is what a forest actually wants to look like if it's left alone in the Northeast. And it's all about complexity, which comes naturally by taking a step back and letting multiple generations of a living system grow, die, and regenerate without removing anything from that system. Viewing forest health through the lens of habitat rather than bored feet can be in part defined by the amount of coarse woody debris that's present. In a healthy temperate forest like the one that we live in, up to 30% of total woody biomass in a forest may be in the form of coarse woody debris. This complex forest structure supports a myriad niche habitats that are often absent from young and managed forests. And it goes without saying that with those niche habitats come countless species that have evolved for millions of years to rely on them. Vast interconnected landscapes that include wild complex forests offer some of the best hope that we have for wildlife to survive and adapt to climate change. But what about the forests themselves? So that gets into wild resilience and what happens below the surface, not only above it. In wild forests where soil is left undisturbed, complexity, again, using that word, increases, and vast mycorrhizal networks help trees, especially older ones, share carbon between one another, and even between different species, which is pretty amazing to think about. This was recently featured in a New York Times article that is highly worth tracking down. If you haven't read it, the cover you can see on the left side of the screen, so you can see that title. And these networks become more connected the less disturbed the forest is, and they help forests react to and survive stress. We've recently learned that these vast underground mycorrhizal networks actually share resources between species and may even help trees communicate. This is an emerging area of science that holds a lot of promise. Finally, I want to talk about reciprocity. What does that have to do with wilderness or wildlands conservation? As stated before, the intentional act of setting aside a piece of land for its own intrinsic value requires humility, and rewilding the mind is part of that humility. And at a societal level, it is equally as important as rewilding the land itself, because one won't happen without the other. Understanding reciprocity, or in my case, just trying to understand the concept and scratching the surface, is foundational to seeing more wildlands on our landscape. Reciprocity, both the rekindling of our affection for the wild and the practice of this awakening. It is an encounter that reaches beyond the give and take of materials, and in its deepest sense, it is a visceral revelation of our seamless connection with all of the manifestations of this planet. Connecting with untrammeled places is integral to the cultivation of an ethical foundation that guarantees the preservation of diverse, resilient, and self-willed communities. And this is why wild places, this is why Northeast Wilderness Trust preserves wild places, and why we're dedicated to the reciprocal act of offering our wild neighbors places where they may rest, recover, and thrive. So I have a couple slides left, and I want to return to the context map. If you recall, approximately only 3% of the Northeast landscape is permanently conserved as wild. And again, less than 1% of the entire region is old growth. And in Vermont, the same statistic holds true. About 3% of the state is wild. And you now have a better idea of what sets wild forests apart from managed forests and why they're complementary and they serve different purposes, and why wildlands are so integral and effective for climate change. It stands to reason that we need more of them. So how much? I sit on the steering committee of the Wildlands and Woodlands Initiative, which calls for at least 7% of all of New England to be wild, or 10% of all conserved forests. And in Vermont, as Eric talked about, the brilliant VCD document calls for approximately 9% of the state to be old forest. Excuse me. These approaches represent, and I say this respectfully, the conservative side, and again, I use that term conservative in a way that I also want to acknowledge that we are nowhere even close to either of those goals. So frankly, they are still incredibly ambitious in their own right. However, the planet is on fire, and we find ourselves in the middle of an urgent biodiversity crisis. All of us sitting here, and in fact, every human across the planet relies on biodiversity to survive. Science suggests, and even Pope Francis has stressed, that the accelerating loss of biodiversity threatens human existence. And in a world of unraveling ecosystems and runaway climate chaos, our species simply may not survive. President Biden has described the climate emergency as an existential challenge. And in fact, about an hour before this presentation, President Biden, I believe, signed or announced his intention of signing his 30 by 30 executive order, which is big news. So characterizing this as an existential challenge, as our president has, is not an exaggeration. It's truly what's at stake. And to tackle the twin crises of global warming and biodiversity collapse, I think we need to be bolder than 7, 9, or 10%. And Northeast Wilderness Trust is a member of Nature Needs Half and a staunch supporter of the 30 by 30 initiative, which calls for 30% of the planet to be conserved as wild for biodiversity. And it's based on the Global Deal for Nature, which refers to protected areas as defined by the IUCN, which are equivalent to our nationally used GAP 1 or GAP 2 lands. It's also a stepping stone to half Earth, as articulated by E.O. Wilson, and associated efforts sometimes referred to as 50 by 50. Can such initiatives be applied in Vermont? I believe they can, and I would argue that they must. Just as this state proudly led on civil unions and eventually the Marriage Equality Act, Vermont can lead the country by building flourishing human communities within a context of healthy, functional ecosystems where all beings, including our wild cousins and us acting as plain citizens in the community of life, are given space and freedom to pursue life and liberty and happiness. What are the barriers to achieving that vision? And I like to look at the positive. So what are the opportunities? This is, I got 2 slides left, so I'm almost done. I believe that there are 3 opportunities for realizing a wilder Vermont. The first is reimagining what the Forest Legacy Program can mean for conservation. Forest Legacy is one of the largest sources of conservation dollars available. And with the permanent funding of the Land and Water Conservation Fund recently, the impact of this source of funding is going to grow dramatically. I've heard time and time again that Forest Legacy dollars are really meant for managed forests or the working landscape. And this is simply not true if you read the enabling statute or the guidance documents. A simple decision by the state, who is of course an essential partner in applications to embrace forever wild conservation and to partner on large-scale wild forest legacy projects, could make a profound impact in increasing wildlands across Vermont and on private land. The second opportunity, and perhaps much larger than thinking about forest legacy, is the potential impact of embracing wild forests in our use value program. So I believe that we could include private landowners that encumber their land with perpetual conservation easements in the use value program. And it need not be limited to just forever wild easements, but by allowing permanent forest conservation across the board into the program. I believe that far more forest land will be permanently conserved as wild if this step were taken. Anecdotally, this is a specific study by any means, but anecdotally over the course of my almost 4 years at Northeast Wilderness Trust, I have had dozens of calls with Vermonters interested in forever wild conservation that begin and end with the simple truth that encumbering your land as forever wild prohibits your enrollment in current use. As currently written, Vermont current use program frankly penalizes private forest landowners who want to conserve their land as wild. And we stand alone in this fact in New England. Every other New England state allows for open space or wildlife management to be part of the current use program in some way. So in a sense, Vermont has some room to improve with this. And finally, as you saw in the excellent presentation before me, Vermont has produced a absolutely fantastic vision for our future through the Vermont Conservation Design document. And this opportunity, the opportunity that I see related to Vermont Conservation Design is about creating a roadmap to actually achieving those targets that Eric talked about and creating a timeline perhaps for implementation and perhaps being so bold as tying some of that to 30 by 30 goals. VCD is an incredibly important document and a beautiful idea, but to set the stage for a more hopeful future for Vermont, for my kids, for the entire community, perhaps we could consider firm commitments and objectives in implementing that amazing document. So I want to conclude my presentation with a quote from Mary Bird Davis, which really resonates with me. And that is that we're between two forested worlds, the natural forest of pre-settlement North America and the recovered forest of the future. The earlier forested world is not dead. We are studying and struggling to preserve its living remnants, and we do not believe that the future forest is powerless to be born. These remnants, with our help, will become the seeds from which a renewed forest spreads. So thank you very much. And that is my presentation.
Thank you, John. That was inspiring, and yeah, it was just great. So I'm so glad you could join us. We have a question from Representative Dolan to get us started.
Thank you. That was very helpful and informative. My question is regards to our current use program. As I understand, there's something called ESTAs in Vermont, where we have a process to identify what's called ecologically significant treatment areas that include natural areas, riparian areas, vernal pools, and old forests. Is that a vehicle that is effective, and how do we make that more effective to try to accomplish the goals that you laid out with respect to having a current use program that is functionally equivalent with our neighboring states?
So my understanding of ESTAs is that they've been important for setting aside really significant ecological habitat within larger managed properties. Where I think there's an important difference in what perhaps could be proposed is that there are a lot of landowners in the state of Vermont that would love to enroll their entire property as forever wild, or landowners that just have conservation easements on their property but are not in and of itself eligible for the program. So as I mentioned in my presentation, I've had many conversations with landowners that would love to protect their private land as forever wild, but it is financially unfeasible for them to do so because they will be permanently prohibited with a forever wild conservation easement on their property from enrolling in current use. So it's unfortunately a financial decision that more often than not results in, this doesn't make sense for my family to put a forever wild easement on my property because I need that tax benefit of being in current use. So I think the ESTAs go a long distance in promoting an ecological perspective within our current use program, but I think that there's a much greater need in our state for landowners that want their entire property to be wild, but they can't afford to under the current program. And again, I know that this is a departure from the historical understanding and use of our program, but I will repeat that every other state in New England has space for forever wild conservation within their versions of the current use program. So Vermont kind of stands alone in this area.
Thank you. Who do you think would be helpful for us to bring in to talk about other states' current use programs?
Well, I hate to put anybody on the spot without them being here and volunteering. But I did hear a presentation from Jamie Fidel about a year ago on this exact point. We got together a large group of conservationists just to talk about wild forests. And Jamie put together a wonderful presentation that looked at the laws from every one of these states. And even here at our office, one of my colleagues, Shelby Perry, works across the 6 states, enrolling our properties in the various tax programs. So we could discuss that as well. I am not the expert in the tax law across the New England region, but people have thought about it. And I think it's a very worthwhile effort looking at what other states have done and how they approach this topic.
Yeah, that's great. Jamie is familiar to this committee and is actually coming in this afternoon. So
there you go.
we'll see what he could provide us. Not this afternoon, but another time probably. I'm curious about your lands and how you manage public access on them. We have an ever increasing interest as human beings in being in the woods and experiencing nature. And I am, I guess, specifically wondering about, well, how you manage your lands, but also like what you know about trails and trail density and the impact on natural function.
Sure. So to start, I am a strong proponent of rejecting the idea of one size fits all for any management, and that's why you'll see me, support forestry and wilderness conservation. I think there's a place for everything, and that goes for the same in terms of our management Northeast Wilderness Trust. So we have certain properties that are open to the public in the form of hiking trails. We have a majority of the properties that we own open to the public for hunting. But we also set aside certain properties, which we refer to as sanctuaries, which don't have hiking trails or don't have access for hunting. And that's really dependent on the specific attributes of that property and its context on the landscape, what species exist on the property. We do not have a blanket policy on what on our properties in terms of actual uses, but what we do across the board on all of our properties allow is dispersed access. So anyone can walk on any of our properties. And that's really important because, as you mentioned, not only is there an increase in desire for being outside in the woods, but there's increased necessity for being outside. After a long, stressful day in front of Zoom, for 8 hours a day, it's very healthy to get outside and walk in the woods. So there is a unique experience of being in a wild forest, and we encourage people to explore our properties. They probably won't have hiking trails on them, but you're absolutely welcome to go enjoy the woods. To your second point, there is no doubt that there is a real impact from recreation on wildlife and all forms of recreation. So I am a hiker, but I also recognize that my presence in the woods has an impact on wildlife. And when you multiply me times 10,000 in a forest, we all have an impact on wildlife. Every form of recreation has different impacts, and I think it's very, very important for the state to be looking at the cumulative impact of recreation across the entire landscape. What I think has happened is that there's been an incredible amount of pressure to add hiking trails, mountain bike trails, ATV access, whatever it is. And folks are looking at, in their respective stakeholder groups, at this is the property in my backyard. I really want a trail here. And we're not looking at it cumulative. Well, there's already a trail here. Do we really need one on the next forest and the next forest and the next forest and the next forest? And what happens is all of a sudden there's an incredible amount of pressure, recreational pressure on our forest resources and the wildlife that lives there. So there is some sort of impact. I'm not the expert to tell you exactly what that impact is, but I do believe that there should be a cumulative approach to recreational development so we can be doing this in a smart way that benefits people and benefits our forest resources.
Thank you. Representative Bongartz.
Hi, John. I've actually been thinking about what you've been talking about current use and the way that current use kind of demands active forest management. And at least as I said earlier, I think you were here, at least in my county, what that really means is just inviting invasives. And so I'm curious, do you have any way of, or have you begun to think about, or how would we quantify, is I guess one way to put it, if we were to change the current use program to allow the forest management plan to be effectively forever wild, do you have any sense of the quantity we'd be looking at of landowners who might want to do that, or what it might mean for the program? I realize we're gonna have to ask this question a lot of times of a lot of people as we explore this, but trying to get a sense of I have a sense some people are kind of doing active management who would prefer not to. I think you said that actually.
Yeah.
And that in some cases, not all. And by the way, I'm very much like you. I love the forest products industry, and I recognize, in fact, I'd like to see more of it in some ways, for all the reasons that we all do. But I'm also very cognizant of the fact that, at least in some places, it does irreparable damage. And so I'm just wondering about how we go about quantifying what it might actually mean for the program, how many more parcels or acres we might end up with forever wild, and what it would cost versus what it costs now. Do you have any way to begin to think about that?
Yes, there's a small group of conservation professionals and landowners that are thinking about this, and it begins with an economic study of what the impact could be. For instance, what if 5% of landowners currently enrolled in the current use program decide to manage their land as forever wild? Or conversely, what if 5% of landowners that are not currently enrolled in current use decide to enroll if they had a choice to do so as a forever wild option? I think that there are, maybe 5 or 6 scenarios that could be undertaken through an economic study to see what the impact would be to the state. And I do think that there are both of those camps. There are people that I speak with on a regular basis that are enrolled in current use that are hoping to have a solution before they are, asked to do their next management activity or action. So there are, I say that as another way of saying there are people currently enrolled that would prefer not to manage their property, but they need to be enrolled because it's the only way they can afford to keep their land. And then there's also many people that I speak with that are not currently enrolled in current use and just won't do it because they don't want to manage their property. And I think that those folks would benefit. And it's not only about what happens on that property. If the state of Vermont acknowledges the value of wild forests on our landscape for natural climate solutions and for preserving biodiversity, and perhaps solving, getting to some of the issues that are in the Global Warming Solutions Act, then encouraging more landowners to keep their forests as large tracts and intact tracts of land through the current use program, so long as they're allowed to do it as forever wild, I think could benefit the state in really wonderful ways.
Thank you.
All right, members, we have a little more time if someone has a question, and our previous witnesses are still with us. So Representative Dolan.
I'm intrigued with your presentation and opportunities you describe. I often hear that when we manage our forest, we manage it to achieve a certain degree of performance. Those performance measures or standards are critical, and part of it is getting to some of the values you talked about. A well-functioning forests, for example, healthy soils. Have you given some thought as to if we were to try to pursue something along this line and looking at the type of performance standards we're seeking for such designation of forever wild or conserved lands? Have you given some thought as to what would be helpful performance standards that we can get our arms around so that we can ensure that what we are preserving is in fact going to help us achieve and meet those standards?
That's a great question. I'm going to have to think about this for a second. There are unique attributes to wild forests and places that we leave to be self-willed that are simply not present on managed landscapes. And those serve a lot of wonderful purposes. And one of the things that it serves, which is kind of a roundabout way to get to your question or to answer your question, is that management managed forests need a model to design by. And what I mean by that is the more wild forests we have on the landscape in a representative sample, from floodplain forests to high elevation forests, the more, the better ecologically sound management we will be able to mimic across the managed landscape. And I think most foresters that look at how best to manage a forest use what is a forest supposed to look like as that baseline. And the more wild forests that we allow on the landscape, the more opportunities we have to really understand what our forests are trying to be, and how we can best mimic natural processes. On the ground, another way to perhaps get to your question is the carbon impact. Wild forests that are allowed to grow old store different amounts of carbon than young forests and managed forests. And perhaps the state of Vermont has carbon goals that could only be achieved if a certain percentage of our state is left to grow old in terms of our forests. So that's another way of looking at it, perhaps from a carbon perspective. How many tons of carbon do we want to leave on the landscape? And how many tons of carbon do we want to see sequestered on an annual basis? And the science shows that wild and unmanaged forests do a superb job at both of those things.
All right, great. John, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. This was very edifying. I know we learned, all of us, I'm sure, learned a lot today. So
thank you.
Thank you again. And with that, committee, we will take a break for lunch, and I recommend getting outside and renewing yourself. This afternoon, we don't anticipate too much floor time, sorry. And we have Jamie Fidel talking about forest fragmentation at 2 o'clock. So